We come now to what must amount to the most quintessential miracle that Jesus ever performed. It's the miracle of Jesus walking on water, and the event is so startling and original that there's no parallel that I know of anywhere in literature or in history. I'm reading from John's Gospel, chapter 6, verse 16 to verse 24. When evening came, his disciples went down to the lake, where they got into a boat and set off across the lake for Capernaum. By now it was dark, and Jesus had not yet joined them. A strong wind was blowing, and the waters grew rough. When they'd rowed 3 or 3.5 miles, they saw Jesus approaching the boat, walking on the water. And they were terrified. But he said to them, "It is I. Don't be afraid." And then they were willing to take him into the boat, and immediately the boat reached the shore where they were heading. The next day, the crowd that had stayed on the opposite shore of the lake realized that only one boat had been there, and that Jesus had not entered it with his disciples, but that they had gone away alone. And then some boats from Tiberias landed near the place where the people had eaten the bread after the Lord had given thanks. And once the crowd realized that neither Jesus nor his disciples were there, they got into the boat and went to Capernaum in search of Jesus. As I say, this is one of the most astonishing stories in all of literature. Nowhere can you find a story like this. And nowhere would you find it even in the realms of fiction. This is something, though, which is presented as fact to us. And I think the only way that we can get some grasp of it is to try to envisage what it was like to be there at that time. So, Jesus has just fed 5,000 people. They'd taken hours for them to walk to get to Jesus, and Jesus spent hours distributing the food to them when they'd arrived. It's not surprising that evening had come, and his disciples, when evening came, went down to the lake where they got into a boat and set off to the lake for Capernaum. No doubt Jesus had instructed them where he was going to go, and told them to go ahead of him and maybe prepare the way. They probably didn't understand how he was going to make his way to Capernaum. They probably thought that maybe he would come the long way round, get a lift from someone else somehow or other, but no doubt they must have been, I would think, reluctant to leave him behind. But nevertheless, Jesus was probably insistent that they go to Capernaum and make preparations for him to come there. And by now, it was dark, so you can envisage the huge Sea of Galilee before them. In front of them, this cold, dark lake, late in the evening, getting on for night time, darkness falling, the wind whipping up, the waves being quite rough at that time, and the disciples, let's say pretty well all of them, let's say all 12 of them, getting into a boat which was just big enough for them and sailing off. Obviously, probably I would think with some reluctance. People gather around Jesus Christ and do not want to let him go, and that's something which is as powerfully evident from these stories. The crowds there, wherever he happened to go, they would follow him. Such was his fame and such was his ability to command an audience that nobody wanted to be outside of his presence who knew him. So he sent them off. I can only expect that with some degree of forcefulness for them to go. They wondered, how will you get and join us? They probably asked him. He said, I have ways and means probably of which you know not. They took that to mean that he would find his way. A strong wind was blowing. The waters grew rough. That makes it even more difficult for someone to cross over, even for them to cross over, because 12 in a boat would be quite difficult for them to do that. When they had rowed 3 or 3.5 miles, now that would take some time to throw 3.5 miles, particularly if the wind was blowing and the waters were rough. So it's a rowboat, a large boat, a fishing boat no doubt, which was the main principal kind of boat that probably one of them owned, or maybe 2 of them owned, and they had got into the boat and rowed 3.5 miles. I'm not sure how long that would take, but let's say it takes an hour or so to do that. So they're crossing the middle of the lake, and in the darkness, with the wind, wrapping up themselves cold and being tossed about in the boat. But these are rough fishermen. They know their way in boats, and they know how to get to the other side. After they'd rowed 3.5 miles, which I say took them some time, they saw Jesus approaching the boat. Now, what can you say? The darkness, the wind, the howling gales or the waves splashing about, and you see this figure through the darkness coming closer and closer. Clearly have to be fairly close to be able to see what was going on. And in order to navigate in the darkness, true, you'd have to know where you were going and have some very good way of finding your way. I don't think they had compasses in those days, so if they headed towards Capernaum, they would need all their wits about them. And what's more, though, they'd be able to see something in the darkness, because it's never entirely dark, not with the moon out and with starlight. So there is a vague apprehension of a figure coming towards them, and the figure of Jesus was able to home in exactly on where the boat was. That itself is miraculous, to be able to find a boat like that in the darkness, or the darkness is only the moonlight there. But you can see yourself as one of these people in the boat, tired, exhausted, rowing through the harsh weather, and an apparition before them or coming closer to them across the surface of the water. What would you think? I think you'd be terrified at such a visage. You'd be horrified. You can only imagine that it can be some apparition, some ghost-like, some phantom, something unearthly, something out of the ordinary. No human being could it be, because how could they walk across the water? An impossibility. The only thing is a ghostly phantom of the demonic kind, maybe, something which would terrify these people in the boat. That's what you've got to imagine. With the wind blowing, the waves tossing the boat backwards and forwards, and this apparition coming closer and closer. They say they were terrified, and you can imagine the terror. What would it be? Something completely out of their known understanding. And yet there was this personage. But it said here, he said to them, "It is I, do not be afraid." He must have noticed their fear, quaking, cowling, hiding themselves in the boat, screaming in terror, shouting to each other, "What can it be?" and being petrified to death by this event in the darkness. They were trying to keep away from this until he spoke to them, at which point they recognized the voice, they recognized what he was saying, and even then it says that they were willing to take him into the boat. But you know what? To me, there's almost an even greater terror here, knowing that this is Jesus. I don't know if you can feel the impression of what's going on here, but this is somebody who is special, yes. who has the words of wisdom and of God about him, yes. But can you envisage somebody with so much power that they can walk on water? If they can do that, what else can they do? They can do pretty much anything they like. This is someone with the power of the universe within the palm of their hands, and that itself is a terrifying incident. I once saw a series of a film, The Twilight Zone. I think it was made by Spielberg, I can't remember now. And it had 4 stories in it. One of the stories was the most terrifying of all to me. And that was, there was a young boy who suddenly had the power of miracles and could do anything that he wanted to do. Anything, literally anything that he wanted to do. And he could turn people into different shapes. He could make things appear, disappear. Anything that you wanted. He had absolute power over the world. And it was the most terrifying of the 4 because wielding that kind of power, being somebody in that particular place who can do anything that they want, is terrifying because suddenly you are at the entire mercy of such a person. They can do whatever they like. And the terror of the unknown, the terror of the apparition coming, must not simply have been replaced by the terror of the sheer power of this person. There's a small glimpse of it in the presence of a sovereign despot, when you are in the presence of someone like King Henry VIII, or of Genghis Khan, or of Mao Zedong, or of Stalin, someone who had the power of life and death over everyone around them. Simply they could say the word and you'd be taken away and executed at a moment's notice. That kind of power that people have over others, being in the presence of the Emperor Caligula or Nero, whose whim it was, whatever they wanted, it would be done, and the power of the entire Roman state was behind whatever they required. They could have you killed in a moment. And there's a fear which that generates, the fear of standing in the presence of absolute power. And the only thing which shields you from that is the benevolence of the person who wields that kind of power. That's the only thing, I think, where you can take some kind of comfort and not be terrified to death. Knowing that it was Jesus, knowing his character, knowing his concern for people, is the only thing that would prevent you from recoiling in sheer terror at someone walking over the water and landing in your boat. Knowing the character of the person is the only thing which can prevent you from understanding that this person could take away your life like that, or could do anything that they wanted. It's a sheer terror to be confronted by absolute power. And yet it resides in this person. That's the only thing you can say about what this story is telling us here. We're being taught here that this person, unlike any other person who's ever lived, contains within themselves the power to do anything. And if he has the power to do anything he wants, he has the power of life and death over everyone around him. That's a very sobering thought. They were then willing to take him into the boat only because they knew who he was and they had a relationship with him. And immediately the boat, it said, reached the shore where they were standing. So he crossed over pretty well nearly all of the Lake of Galilee. All of that he'd walked over. Not just a small amount, but the whole bit. Astonishing. And the next day, the crowd that had stayed on the opposite side of the shore realized that only one boat had been there and that Jesus had not ended it with his disciples. So They obviously saw the disciples leaving, they saw them getting into the boat, and they saw that Jesus wasn't in there, that Jesus was there, staying on the same side as they were. They stayed with him. Jesus sent the disciples away. And if I suppose Jesus had got into the boat with the disciples and gone off, the crowds would have followed. But here the crowds did not follow. And the reason they did not follow is because Jesus was still there. Maybe that was the reason why Jesus sent them on ahead, so that they would have some break from the huge crowds that pressed in upon them. He knew that he could keep the crowds there because he was staying there. And yet, during the night, Jesus ventured out onto the water, walked across the water in an unprecedented miracle, and he then went away and caught up with them. That left the crowd utterly astonished and bewildered. How on earth did you get there? You know, he knew that the disciples had gone away alone. And some boats from Tiberias landed near the place where the people had eaten the bread after the Lord had given thanks, presumably because people had heard that Jesus was over there on the other side of the lake, and so many people who had boats decided that they would go across the lake to see Jesus. They arrived over that way. But once the crowd realized that neither Jesus nor his disciples were there, and that must have surprised them greatly, they got into the boats and went to Capernaum in search of Jesus. And, of course, when they did find him, they were astonished. But the crowds follow him wherever he goes. But now we're getting a clearer picture of this person, which is, at the very least, breathtaking. It's a picture of a person unlike any other person we've ever come across. It's a picture of a person who has unlimited power and resources at his control and command. It's a person who, well, that shouldn't surprise you if you believe John in chapter 1, because this is the Word who was with God and was in the beginning with God, and nothing was made that has been made without the Word of God being involved. If you understand that central truth which John starts his gospel with, then it's only a small matter to understand that this is a person who can walk across water, who can make bread from virtually nothing, who can make wine from nothing. Bread and wine both together have been multiplied. And yet none of that surprises us if we take for granted and believe and understand the very first verse of John's Gospel. None of that should be a surprise to us if we believe that this is the one who was with God in the beginning and who was God. Believe that, everything follows. Don't believe that, and nothing makes any sense. Believe that, and you have a person here with whom all the authority and power of God resides, and whose time has now come to show that.